A/N. To clarify for the lore, the manga's original race is an overlord, an evolutionary peak of the skeleton mage/lich line. In this fanfiction, his emotional suppressor, the green flash that usually keeps him calm and robotic, seems to be failing against his new, primal nature. Different race, different emotional influencer. The artifact of the world disaster. The air in the secret treasury of Nazarick was thick with the scent of ancient dust and the hum of world-class magic. Mamanga, the supreme being now known as Ainz, stood before the mausoleum of his former comrades. His skeletal fingers, usually cold and steady, twitched with a phantom anxiety. He was preparing to die, or, at the very least, preparing to fight a battle where his survival was a coin flip. Shaltir Bloodfallen, the masterpiece of Pero Roncino, had been mind-controlled, and Ainz saw it as his sole responsibility as guild master to rectify the failure. "I need more power," he hissed, his voice a dry rattle. "Not just levels. I need an edge that defies the logic of Yggdrasil." His crimson orb glowed as he bypassed the main armaments, moving toward a secluded pedestal near the statue of Ulbert Alanodal. Ulbert, the great demon and world disaster, had always been obsessed with raw, destructive scale. On the pedestal sat a jagged shard of obsidian that seemed to swallow the light around it. It pulsed like a dying star. Ainz reached out. As his phalanges brushed the surface, a screen of light, the familiar Yggdrasil interface, flickered into existence. Item name: Heart of the Primordial. Creator: Ulbert Alanodal. Description: an item to make the powerful more powerful. A gift for the one who stands at the peak, should they find the view too lonely. Ulbert. Ainz whispered. He felt a pang of nostalgia. Ulbert had spent months of dev time trying to create a class-breaker item, something that could bypass the hard caps of the game's racial levels. It was rumored to be a failure, a trap item that consumed the user's data. He actually finished it? Or is this your final prank, old friend? Ainz gripped the obsidian shard to inspect its stats. Suddenly, the item didn't just vibrate, it screamed. A blinding, violet-white flash erupted from the shard. It wasn't the clean light of holy magic, but a chaotic, roaring energy that felt like a tectonic plate shifting. Outside the vault, the very foundations of the great tomb of Nazarick groaned. Albedo, who had been waiting near the exit with Yuri Alpha and Pandora's actor, shielded her eyes as a shockwave blew the massive doors off their hinges. "Lord Ainz," Albedo screamed, her black wings unfurling in a panicked reflex. As the light died down, the silhouette in the center of the room was no longer a skeleton in regal robes. The figure was massive, towering over 3 meters tall. The robes of the 41 supreme beings had been shredded, hanging like loincloths and tattered capes over a physique that defied nature. The new Ainz was a titan. His skin was the color of weathered marble, etched with glowing violet veins that pulsed like lava. His muscles were corded and dense, possessing a weight that seemed to crack the floor beneath his feet. Where a hollow ribcage once sat, there was now a broad, heaving chest of living stone and divine flesh. His face was no longer a mask of bone, but a handsome, terrifying visage of primordial fury, with eyes that burned like twin suns. The sheer pressure of his passive aura had changed. It was no longer the despair aura of the undead, it was a crushing weight of dominion. Pandora's actor fell to his knees, his flamboyant persona momentarily shattered by the raw, physical presence of his creator. Yuri Alpha took a step back, her mechanical heart fluttering in a way her programming shouldn't allow. Albedo, however, didn't just stare. She trembled. Her breath hitched, and a flush crept up her neck. The love programmed into her by Tabula Smaragdus was reacting to this new, hypermasculine divinity. Ainz, the Titan, looked down at his hands. He didn't feel the cold logic of the Lich anymore. He felt a roaring fire in his gut. He felt hungry. He felt want. The world, Ainz spoke, and his voice wasn't a rattle. It was a tectonic rumble that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. It feels so much smaller now. The gathering of the Guardians. The throne room of Nazarick had never felt cramped until this moment. Usually, the vast ceiling and the towering statues of the 41 supreme beings created a sense of infinite space. But as the floor guardians assembled, the air felt thick, charged with static tension that made the very stones hum. They had been summoned in haste, the message relayed through message spells that carried an uncharacteristic edge of raw power. One by one, they knelt. Demiurge, Cositus, Aura, and Mare took their places. At the front, Albedo remained in a state of rigid, trembling devotion, her eyes never leaving the dais. Steps echoed. Not the light, clicking sound of skeletal feet, but heavy, rhythmic thuds that shook the floor. Ainz Olgown emerged from the shadows behind the throne of kings. He was no longer the lich they knew. He stood nearly 11 feet tall, a colossus of bronze-hued skin and marble-hard muscle. The shreds of his former regalia had been replaced by a hastily fashioned wrap of dark, enchanted silk that clung to his massive frame. His eyes, once flickering red dots and hollow sockets, were now molten pits of gold that seemed to see through the very walls of the tomb. The guardians gasped in unison. The pressure he exerted was physical. It felt as though the gravity in the room had doubled. "My guardians," Ainz began. His voice was a deep, resonant cello that vibrated in their chests. "I have undergone a refinement. Olbert's legacy has stripped away the limitations of the bone to reveal the titan beneath." He sat upon the throne, and the ancient artifact groaned under his new weight. He leaned forward, resting a massive chin on a hand the size of a shield. The usual green flash of his emotional suppressor flickered weakly for a microsecond before being snuffed out by the sheer heat of his new temperament. "I have called you here to announce my departure," Ainz continued, his gaze drifting toward the horizon beyond the walls. "Shaltir Bloodfallen has turned her fang against the great tomb. I will go alone to provide her the mercy of a swift end." The silence that followed was brittle. In the past, they would have obeyed without a word. But the sight of their master changed, radiating a heat and a vitality that was almost intoxicating, triggered an instinctual terror. They didn't fear his power. They feared losing this new, magnificent sun that had suddenly appeared in their sky. Pandora's actor, standing slightly to the side of the throne, was the first to break. He did not strike his usual dramatic pose. His uniform was rumpled, and his head was bowed low. "Father," he whispered, his voice cracking. The title slipped out, raw and unpracticed. "My creator, I beg of you, look upon us. Look upon the treasures you have spent your life protecting." He took a step forward, his metallic fingers trembling. "You have only just arrived in this glorious new form. Your essence is still settling. To risk yourself now against a threat as volatile as the true vampire, it is a weight we cannot bear. Please, I implore you, stay. Let me go in your stead. Let me be the shield that breaks before you are even scratched." The sincerity in the NPC's voice was like a spark in a powder keg. "Lord Ainz," Demiurge cried out, his voice uncharacteristically high. He slammed his fist against the floor, cracking the tile. "Pandora's actor speaks the truth of our hearts. You are the soul of Nazarick. This change, it is breathtaking, yes, but it is unknown. To face Shaltir while your very nature is in flux is a risk to the entire foundation of our existence. Please, let us handle the traitor." "I cannot lose you," Albedo shrieked, finally snapping. She lunged forward, not to attack, but to clasp her hands in a desperate prayer. Her face was flushed, her breath coming in ragged. Ainz looked down at them. In his old form, he would have been flustered, searching for a way to calm them with logic. But the Titan felt only a soaring sense of pride. Their begging didn't annoy him, it fed the fire in his blood. He felt a dark, pulsing lust for their absolute submission, not just for their service, but for their complete acknowledgement of his supremacy. He stood up, his massive shadow swallowing the kneeling guardians. "Be silent," he commanded, and the word hit them like a physical blow. The king's rebuttal. The silence that followed Ainz's command was not the respectful quiet of a typical meeting. It was a vacuum, a total absence of sound where the only thing that existed was the thrumming of the Titan's heart. Ainz stepped down from the dais. Each movement felt liquid, yet possessed the weight of a falling mountain. He stopped directly in front of Albedo. Her head was bowed so low her forehead touched the cold stone, but he could see the tremors racking her shoulders. He could smell the ozone of her fear and the heavy, sweet scent of her obsession. Under the influence of the Titan's blood, Ainz felt a surge of dominance that the skeleton mage never could have processed. He reached down, his hand now large enough to crush her skull like a grape, and gently hooked a finger under her chin. He forced her to look up. "You speak of protection, Albedo," Ainz rumbled, his voice dropping to a low, predatory purr. "You speak of my safety as if I am a fragile vase to be kept behind glass. Do you not see what I have become?" He let go of her chin and swept his arms out, gesturing to his own massive, revitalized form. The violet veins in his skin flared with a sudden, blinding intensity. The undead are static. They are echoes of the past. But this... He looked at his fist, clenching it until the air itself seemed to pop with the pressure. This is growth. This is the primal hunger of the beginning of time. You fear for me because you still see the bone, but I am the earth itself now. He turned his gaze toward Demiurge, who looked as though he were undergoing an internal crisis of logic. "And you, Demiurge, you wish to study me? To put your creator under a magnifying glass before he acts." Ainz let out a short, bark-like laugh that echoed like a thunderclap. "Your intellect is your greatest tool, but do not let it become a shackle for your master. I do not need a laboratory. I need a battlefield to test the limits of this new divinity." Finally, he looked at Pandora's actor. The doppelganger was the most shaken of them all. To a creation, the sudden transformation of a creator is a fundamental shift in reality. "My son," Ainz said, the word son carrying a weight of prideful ownership it never had before. "Your concern is noted, and in a way, it pleases me. It shows that the loyalty I carved into your soul remains intact. But look at me. Truly look at me." Ainz leaned down, his face inches from Pandora's actor's featureless mask. The Titan's eyes were like looking into the birth of a star. "I feel a lust for this conflict that I haven't felt in 100 years. I do not go to fight Shaltir out of duty alone. I go because I wish to see her broken beneath this new strength. I go because the Titan demands a sacrifice." The Guardians were paralyzed. The Ainz they knew was gone, replaced by a being of overwhelming ego and physical perfection. The emotional suppressor flashed one last time, a pathetic spark of green light behind his eyes, before the Titan's sheer willpower crushed it into nothingness. "I have made my decision," Ainz said, standing tall once more. "I will go. You will stay. You will watch from the mirrors, and you will learn what happens when a supreme being truly unleashes the nature he was born to possess." He turned his back on them, his dark silk cloak billowing behind him like a storm cloud. "Prepare the gate," he commanded. "The Titan goes to war." The promise of the sun. The air near the gate shimmered, but the departure was delayed. Pandora's actor, the creation made from the very soul of the man who was once Mamanga, took a staggering step forward. His boots clicked sharply against the obsidian floor, a sound of desperation in the hollow silence. "Father," he cried out again. The word was a jagged plea. "If not for your safety, then for the future. You have no other heirs. I have no siblings to share the weight of your legacy should the unthinkable occur. If the stars wink out today, Nazarick falls into eternal night. Let me go. Let Demiurge go. We are but tools to be blunted. You are the hand that wields us." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Pandora's actor wanted to say more, to beg on behalf of the lineage that didn't yet exist, to speak of the loneliness of being the only direct creation of the last supreme being, but the words died in his throat. He choked on his own grief, his featureless face tilted upward in a silent scream of devotion. The Titan turned. Ainz looked at his creation, and for a moment, the predatory lust in his eyes softened into something ancient and paternal. He did not look like a skeleton pretending to be a king. He looked like a god acknowledging his worshipper. A ruler who hides behind his children is no ruler at all. Ain's voice rolled through the hall, calm yet absolute. The walls of Nazareth are not meant to be a cage for me, nor a shield for my cowardice. I am the apex. If a member of my house is manipulated, if Shaltir is made a puppet by lesser beings, it is a stain upon my honor. I will not allow my people to be toyed with. He reached out, his massive, warm hand hovering near Pandora's actor's head. The heat radiating from his palm was like a hearth fire. I will return with Shaltir, Ainz promised, a slow, confident smirk spreading across his marble-like features. And when the dust settles, I have heard your heart. I shall consider it. Perhaps it is time I populated these halls with more of my blood. You shall have your siblings, my son. You will not be alone in your vigil for long. With that final, earth-shaking promise, Ainz stepped into the swirling violet vortex of the gate. The magical aperture collapsed behind him, leaving the room in a sudden, jarring cold. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before Demiurge exploded. Idiots! The archdevil roared, his face contorting into a mask of demonic fury. His tail lashed behind him, cracking the air like a whip. He turned on the other guardians, his eyes glowing with a murderous light. How could you let him walk through that door? He is transformed. His mind is altered. We are vulnerable, and he is walking into a trap set by the unknown. If he falls, we are nothing but dust and echoes. Demiurge looked ready to strike, his claws extending as he paced like a caged beast. He was the smartest man in Nazareth, and his intellect was currently screaming at him that they had failed their primary directive, the protection of the Supreme One. Shut up. Just shut up already. The high-pitched, cracking voice of Ora Bellafiora cut through Demiurge's tirade. She and Mare stood side by side, the young dark elves trembling not with fear of Demiurge, but with the sheer weight of their own emotions. Tears stood in Ora's heterochromatic eyes, but her gaze was fierce. You think we don't know that? Ora yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. You think we aren't scared? We saw him before the flash, Demiurge. We saw our master when he was bone and shadow, and we see him now as a titan. He changed, yeah, he's louder, he's prouder, he's different. But he is still Lord Ainz. He is a wise king, Mare added softly, his voice shaking as he clutched his staff, but his eyes were steady. A benevolent king. An all-powerful ruler who owns each and every star in the sky. He chose this. He chose to become this to save one of us. Ora stepped forward, looking at the assembled might of Nazareth, the guardians of the floors, the pinnacle of their world. Tell me, Ora challenged, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. What kind of king do you believe he is? If you don't trust his strength, then what are we even doing here? One by one, the guardians spoke their truth, their voices building into a litany of faith. They spoke of his tactical genius, his mercy, and his overwhelming presence. When your God tells you to trust them, Ora finished, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, you give them every last drop of your trust. Now obey our ruler. Sit, watch, and witness as our king brings an end to the manipulation of Shaltir Bloodfallen. Reluctantly, Demiurge sank to his knees, his anger replaced by a chilling, focused dread. They all turned toward the grand mirror in the center of the room, waiting for the first image of the Titan on the battlefield. The armor of the Colossus. In the silence of the throne room, the grand magical mirror flared to life, its surface rippling like water before settling into a crystal-clear view of the forest outskirts. The guardians watched, breathless, as the Titan, their master, began his preparations. He did not move with the frantic haste of a man afraid. He moved with the tectonic deliberation of a force of nature. To hide his new, radiant form from the eyes of the world, Ainz summoned the blackened plate of the adventurer, Mammon. Usually, the armor fit his skeletal frame with a slight, hollow rattle. Now, as the magical metal expanded to accommodate his massive Titan physique, it groaned. The pauldrons widened, the chest piece swelled to house his broad, heaving lungs, and the twin greatswords on his back looked like pillars of steel. Cocytus, whose own body was a temple of martial prowess, let out a huff of freezing vapor. His mandibles clicked in deep appreciation. "Look at him," Cocytus rumbled, his forearms crossing over his chest. "He does not walk like a soldier. He marches like a conqueror to his certain victory. The ground itself seems to submit to his stride." Through the mirror, they saw Ainz standing amongst the humans and the hidden observers. He was declaring his intent to hunt down the vampire who had caused such chaos. He spoke of tracking her, of knowing her every move. When he uttered the false name he had concocted for the brainwashed Shaltir, a string of syllables so absurd and nonsensical a small, strained ripple of amusement broke through the tension in the throne room. Aura let out a tiny snort, and even Albedo's lips twitched. It was a classic Ainz-sama moment, a brilliant mind creating a ridiculous alias to baffle his enemies. But the humor was short-lived. Within the crowd on the screen, a man stepped forward. He was a mercenary, or perhaps a minor noble. The Guardians didn't care for his name, only his tone. He began to mock the vampire, calling her a mindless beast, a stray dog that needed to be put down. Then, his tongue turned sharper, more foolish, as he insulted the braggart in the black armor, questioning if Mammon was simply looking for a quick payout or a chance to bet a monster. The disrespectful words were like acid in the Guardian's ears. Albedo's hands clawed at her own thighs, and Demiurge's eyes narrowed into slits of murderous intent. "He dares," Albedo hissed, her voice a low, demonic growl. Then, they looked closer at the mirror. Ainz had not moved. He remained a silent statue of black steel. But the Guardians, who knew the cadence of his soul, saw what the humans could not. Underneath the helmet, the Titan's golden eyes weren't just glowing, they were burning with a cold, glacial fury that seemed to frost the very edges of the mirror's image. The air around the Mammon on screen began to shimmer. The grass at his feet withered and turned to ash, not from a spell, but from the sheer heat of his suppressed rage. To the humans, he looked like a stoic hero. To the Guardians, he looked like a volcano seconds away from erasing a civilization. A shiver raced down Mare's spine, and even Cocytus stood straighter. It was the Titan's wrath, a pride so immense that the mockery of a common insect was no longer an annoyance, it was a death sentence. Ainz finally spoke. His voice was clipped, devoid of the cello-like resonance from before, replaced by a flat, terrifying finality. "You may come," Ainz said to the man, his words falling like a guillotine blade. "But you will die." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and began the march toward the clearing where Shaltir waited. The Guardians watched in grim satisfaction. They knew that when their master spoke a truth in that tone, the universe itself conspired to make it so. "The hunt has begun," Demiurge whispered, his anger finally cooling into a sharp, clinical focus. "Let us see how the vampire fares against a god who has forgotten how to be merciful." The weight of a promise. The journey through the forest had been an exercise in agonizing restraint. For 5 hours, the mercenary leader, a man whose ego far outstripped his lifespan, had filled the air with the stench of his arrogance. His party, a group of 4 seasoned but foolish killers, joined in the chorus. They spoke of the vampire as if she were a common whore to be broken, laughing about the trophies they would take from her corpse. Behind the visor of the Mammon armor, Ainz's new Titan blood was boiling. Every insult directed at Shaltir, his comrade's creation, a daughter of Nazarick, felt like a physical strike against his own divinity. "I told you once," Ainz's voice came from the depths of the black steel, sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "You will die a dog's death today." If you step into that clearing, you forfeit the right to a quick end." The mercenary laughed, spitting on the ground. "Big talk for a man in a tin suit. We're the ones with the silver stakes, hero. You just stay back and watch how we handle a monster." They reached the clearing. The air was still, heavy with the presence of the brainwashed Shaltir standing like a scarlet statue in the distance. Ainz stopped. He did not look at the vampire. He turned his attention solely to the 5 humans. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unclasped the twin great swords and drove them into the earth. Then, he reached for his helmet. As the armor dissolved into magical particles, the humans froze. The man standing before them suddenly expanded. His skin turned to the color of bruised marble. His height surged until he loomed over them like a cliffside. The sheer pressure of the Titan's unveiling snapped the nearby trees like toothpicks. 5 hours, Ainz rumbled, his golden eyes burning with a terrifying, lustful cruelty. 5 hours of your filth. Now I shall take 15 minutes of your lives. The slaughter was not a battle. It was a biological dismantling. The first mercenary tried to scream, but Ainz moved with the speed of a lightning strike. A massive, warm hand clamped over the man's face. With a sickening series of pops, sounding like dry wood snapping, Ainz began to squeeze. He didn't crush the skull instantly. He methodically broke every facial bone, one by one, feeling the structure collapse beneath his fingers. The leader tried to flee, but the Titan's foot came down on his legs. The sound of the man's femurs shattering filled the clearing. "You called her a beast," Ainz whispered, leaning down as he gripped the leader's shoulder. Ainz didn't use a knife. He used the sharpened, divine edge of his own fingernails. With the precision of a master surgeon and the malice of a demon, he began to peel. He caught the edge of the man's skin at the collarbone and pulled. The sound was like wet parchment being torn. The man's screams reached a pitch that should have been impossible for human lungs, but Ainz used a silent low-tier heel to ensure the heart kept beating, ensuring the nerves remained raw and screaming. In the throne room, the guardians watched in a state of rapturous awe. Demiurge was leaning forward, a thin trail of saliva escaping his lips as he analyzed the artistry of his master's work. Albedo was trembling, her wings wrapped tightly around herself, moaning softly at the sight of such absolute, dominant cruelty. Ainz moved to the next, breaking the woman's arms into dozen-inch segments, folding them back upon themselves until she resembled a discarded doll. He was a Titan, a creature of the earth, and he treated their bodies like clay to be reshaped. By the 14th minute, the clearing was painted in a vivid, horrifying crimson. The mercenaries were no longer recognizable as humans. They were mounds of exposed muscle and shattered white bone, still twitching, still breathing through the forced magic of their executioner. "A dog's death," Ainz stated, standing amidst the carnage. He looked down at the leader, who was now nothing more than a red mass of agony. "Is far more than you deserved." With a final, careless stomp, he ended the heartbeat. He turned toward Shaltir, his marble skin stained with the blood of the disrespectful, his eyes refocusing on the true task at hand. The 15 minutes were over. The debt of the insult was paid in full. The master of the board. The carnage behind him was a cooling ruin of meat and bone, but Ainz did not spare it a second glance. His focus was now entirely on the Valkyrie in red. However, even in his heightened state of Titan-born ego, the tactical genius that had made him the leader of the 41 remained. He knew that even a god must account for the unknown. With a thought, he reached into the air, the fabric of reality tearing open to reveal his private treasury. 2 figures stepped through the shimmering rift, Aura and Mare. The twins knelt instantly, their eyes darting briefly to the flayed remains nearby before fixing on their master with unwavering loyalty. "Aura. Mare," Ainz rumbled. He reached into the void and pulled out 2 items of immense power, the depiction of nature and society, and a secondary world-class backup. He handed them over, his massive fingers surprisingly delicate as he entrusted the treasures to the children. These are yours to hold. You will remain on the perimeter. You are the invisible wall. No one human, monster, or god is to interfere with this duel. His golden eyes sharpened, the Titan's pride flashing like lightning. But heed me. If you are outnumbered by even a single soul, if the risk to your safety becomes absolute, you are to flee. These items are worth as much as your lives to me. Protect them, but protect yourselves above all. Do not make me a liar by dying before I can give you the future I promised. We understand, Lord Ainz. Aura cried, her voice cracking with the weight of the honor. With the perimeter set, Ainz turned back to Shaltir. To the world, he was a titan, a beacon of primal power. But to defeat a masterpiece like Shaltir, one needed more than muscle. One needed the deception of a gamer. Disguise, undead, he whispered. The marble flesh and corded muscle didn't vanish, but they were overlaid with a shimmering necro-illusion. To the eyes of any observer, he once again appeared as the gaunt, skeletal overlord. It was a shroud of bone meant to mask the Titan's true vitality, a tactical bait to keep Shaltir fighting a ghost instead of a god. One by one, he began the rhythmic chant of his buffs. The air around him began to distort as layer upon layer of high-tier magic wove into his skin. Body of effulgent barrel. Greater hardening. Mana boost. Lopsided duel. Back in the throne room, the guardians stood in a rigid line. They heard his voice through the mirror, not just in the forest, but echoing through the very stones of the tomb via a telepathic link. From this moment until the end of this conflict, Ainz's voice boomed through the halls of Nazareth. No one is to enter. No one is to leave. The gates are barred. The tomb is silent. Witness the price of rebellion. Ainz threw back his head and let out a laugh. It wasn't the dry, rattling chuckle of a lich. It was the roar of a titan who had tasted blood and found it sweet. The sound shook the birds from the trees for miles. I have made true on one promise this day, he shouted at the unmoving Shaltir, his hand crackling with a sudden, violent heat. The dogs are dead. Now I make true on another. I am bringing you home, Shaltir, broken or whole, you belong to me. He thrust his hand forward. There was no chant, no hesitation, only the raw, explosive release of his intent. Fireball. A sphere of white-hot flame, tripled in size by his titan's natural mana pool, tore through the air. It struck Shaltir directly in her pale, vacant face, turning the clearing into a furnace of blinding light. The battle had begun. The first exchange. The fireball didn't just explode, it roared. In the throne room, the floor guardians leaned closer to the magic mirror. The heat of the blast seemed to radiate through the glass itself. As the smoke cleared, Shaltir Bloodfallen stood in the center of a blackened crater. Her beautiful, gothic dress was singed, and a portion of her porcelain skin had been charred, but the damage was superficial. Her crimson eyes, usually sparkling with sadistic glee, remained hollow, fixed on the skeletal illusion Ainz had cast over his massive frame. A simple fireball? Demiurge whispered, his fingers interlaced so tightly they turned white. Lord Ainz is testing her. Even with his new form, he is not abandoning his caution. He is gauging the resistance of her magic defense. No, Cositus countered, his blue exoskeleton frosting over as he focused. Look at the residual heat. That was not a simple spell. The mana behind it was dense. On the battlefield, Shaltir finally moved. Her body blurred as she activated Time Accelerator. To a normal human, she would have vanished. To the Titan, she was merely moving at a sprint. She lunged, her sprute lance aimed directly for the center of Ainz's chest. Ainz didn't dodge. In his previous life as a skeleton, he would have used a defensive spell or a teleport. Instead, he reached out with a hand that shimmered with the golden light of his Titan blood. Clang. The sound of the divine lance hitting Ainz's palm was like a hammer hitting an anvil. The shockwave flattened the grass for 50 yards in every direction. Shaltier's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, the first sign of the mind struggling against the control. "You've grown fast, Shaltier," Ainz rumbled, his voice still disguised by the rattling tone of the Overlord, yet carrying the crushing weight of the Titan. "But I have grown heavy." With a sudden, violent twist, Ainz grabbed the shaft of the lance. Reality slash. He didn't cast it with his hand. He channeled the 10th tier spell through his very grip. The air around the lance tore open, the spatial rift shearing through Shaltier's defensive aura like paper. She was thrown back, her body tumbling through the air before she stabilized with a frantic flap of her wings. "Master." Shaltier's voice finally broke through the silence. It was a distorted, hollow rasp, the sound of a puppet speaking through a gag. "Enemy must destroy." "Is that all you can say?" Ainz roared. The skeleton mask flickered, revealing the burning gold of the Titan's eyes beneath. The masterpiece of Peroroncino reduced to a broken record? It is an insult. It is a stain on the glory of Nazarick. Back in the throne room, Albedo let out a sharp, ragged breath. He's angry. Not just at the situation. He's angry at her weakness. He's speaking like a father who sees his child has been broken by a common thief. "Look at his stance," Aura pointed out, her eyes glued to the screen. "He isn't even using a weapon. He's waiting for her to hit him again. He's inviting it." Shaltir screeched, a sound that bypassed the ears and grated directly on the soul. She summoned her Einherjar, the shimmering, white-clad clone of herself. "Two of you." Ainz laughed, and the earth beneath him cracked at the sound. "Good. Perhaps now I can stop holding back." He raised a hand, and for the first time, the skeleton disguise began to peel away under the sheer pressure of the mana he was gathering. The air turned violet. The smell of ozone and ancient stone filled the clearing. "Shaltir," Ainz said, his voice dropping to the cello-like rumble of the Titan. "I promised to bring you home. I never promised you'd be able to walk there." The battle in the clearing was no longer a duel between a mage and a warrior. It had become a visceral, grinding test of durability. The sensation of iron. The Sprute Lance danced in the air, a blur of crimson light that sought the gaps in Ainz's invisible defense. Shaltir, driven by the cold directives of her brainwashing, moved with a lethal efficiency that would have shredded any other opponent. Ainz, however, was doing something that horrified the onlookers in the throne room. He was taking the hits. He moved his massive arms just enough to avoid lethal punctures, but he allowed the sharp edges of the lance to graze his marble-like skin. For the first time in this world, perhaps for the first time in his entire existence, Ainz felt it. A sharp, stinging heat. "Pain," Ainz whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying delight. He let out a low chuckle that grew into a booming roar. "So this is what it feels like to be alive. To have nerves that scream. It's exquisite." He swatted at Shaltir, his hand missing her by an inch as she spiraled away. "Fight properly, Shaltir. You are the masterpiece of Peroroncino. You weren't created to be this weak, poking at me like a gnat. Show me the strength that earned you the position of guardian." His pride, swelled by the Titan's blood, made him reckless. He opened his guard, beckoning her forward with a predatory smirk. Shaltir seized the opening. The lance dived in, sinking deep into the meat of Ainz's shoulder. A thick, golden crimson liquid welled up and spilled over his skin. In the throne room, the atmosphere turned toxic. Demiurge's face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated outrage. The glass of the mirror cracked slightly as he gripped the frame. She drew blood. "A creation of Nazarick has dared to pierce the skin of the Supreme One," he hissed, his voice trembling with a desire to commit genocide. "That she would even allow his blood to touch the dirt. It is a sin that eternity cannot wash away." Pandora's actor stood behind him, silent, but his presence had changed. A dark, suffocating aura radiated from him, a new, cold rage that mirrored his creator's evolution. He was no longer just a flamboyant guardian. He was an heir watching his father bleed, and the sight was forging something sharp and jagged in his soul. Albedo, meanwhile, was deathly silent. Her wings were tucked tight, her eyes wide and glazed, watching the golden drop of blood hit the forest floor with the intensity of a zealot watching a miracle. On the field, Shaltir's predatory instincts took over. Seeing the blood of a supreme being, she lunged forward, her mouth unhinging to lap at the divine essence. A trap, Ainz rumbled. The moment her lips neared the wound, Ainz detonated a try-maximize magic. Explode, point blank. The blast was contained, focused entirely on the space between them. The force sent Shaltir flying backward, her armor cracking and her skin blackened by the searing heat. I placed mines across the soil while we spoke, Ainz said, standing tall as the wound on his shoulder began to close with unnatural speed. He gestured to the ground around him. You should use those pretty wings of yours to fly away, little bird. The earth is no longer safe for you. Shaltir, coughing up silver-tinted blood, let out a haunting, mocking laugh. Do you think I am that stupid, my lord? You tell me to fly because you have already seeded the sky with chain dragon lightning or more mines. You want me to choose which way I die? Ainz smirked. He was indeed preserving his mana, using the psychological weight of his new presence to force her into making mistakes. He was a fighter now, one who used magic as a scalpel rather than a crutch. Then stay on the ground, Ainz taunted, his eyes flashing. Stay and see if you can make me bleed again. I find I rather enjoy the taste of my own mortality. He lunged forward, not with a spell, but with a fist the size of a boulder, ready to crush the air from her lungs. The clearing was now a graveyard of shattered trees and scorched earth. The air didn't just smell of ozone, it smelled of the iron in the Titan's blood and the copper of the vampire's gore. The weight of divinity. Shaltir Bloodfallen did not stay down. She rose from the crater of the explosion like a phoenix made of shadow and spite. Her Valkyrie armor was jagged and warped, but her Sprute lance glowed with a renewed, hungry light. She had realized that the overlord she was fighting was a shell, a lie of bones stretched over something far denser, far more ancient. You speak of pride, Lord Ainz, Shaltir hissed, her voice overlapping with the static of her brainwashing. But your pride, it makes you slow. You want to feel? I will give you everything. She invoked Einherjar once more, but this time the construct didn't move to flank him. It merged with her, coating her in a double-layered aura of holy and unholy energy. She became a streak of white-red light, a comet aimed at the Titan's throat. Ainz stood his ground, his feet sinking inches into the soil as he braced. He didn't use a shield. He didn't blink. As she neared, he reached out and caught the tip of the divine lance with his bare forearm. The metal bit deep, sliding through the marble flesh until it hit the dense, titanic bone beneath. Ainz let out a gasp, not of agony, but of a dark, exhilarated triumph. Yes, he roared. Let the world see that even a god can bleed. Let them see that I am not a static thing of dust and magic, but a being of pulse and power. In the throne room, the silence had become deafening. Demiurge was no longer just outraged. He was vibrating with a terrifying, cold calculation. He watched the golden blood coat the Sprute lance, and his mind began to spin toward a dark conclusion. He is teaching her, Demiurge whispered, his voice a jagged edge. He is showing her that, even at her peak, even when she draws the life force of her master, she is but a child playing with a mountain. But the cost is an insult to the very concept of Nazarick. Pandora's actor stood like a statue of obsidian. His typical flamboyant gestures had vanished entirely. His hands were clenched so tightly that the leather of his gloves began to smoke. He was witnessing his creator, his father, purposefully enduring desecration. A new, terrifying thought took root in his mind. If my father is to be a Titan, I must be the one who ensures no one else ever sees him bleed again. Albedo remained the most unsettling. She hadn't moved a muscle, but her eyes were fixed on the screen with a predatory, almost religious fervor. The sight of Ainz in this hypermasculine, vulnerable yet invincible state was doing something to her core programming that was far beyond love. It was a total, obsessive rewriting of her soul. On the field, Ainz suddenly gripped the lance, ignoring the way it tore his flesh. He leaned in close to Shaltir, his face inches from her helmet. "You wonder why I don't use my mana to end this, Shaltir?" Ainz purred, the sound like a landslide. "Because your mind is a weapon I haven't finished using yet. You think you've seen my traps? I haven't even started playing the game." With a sudden surge of physical strength, he swung his arm, and the lance still embedded in it, hurling Shaltir through 3 rows of ancient oaks. He didn't wait for her to land. He began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic, weaving a spell that wasn't aimed at her, but at the very air between them. Body of effulgent barrel. Greater resistance. Mana essence. He wasn't just buffing himself, he was creating a feedback loop. He was baiting her into a war of attrition where every drop of his blood she spilled would only make the eventual explosion of his mana more devastating. He was being reckless, yes. He was being prideful. But he was Ainz Gown, and he was reveling in the fact that for the first time, the world was finally heavy enough to feel. The battlefield was a testament to the Titan's raw influence. The gravity itself seemed to bow to Ainz, making the very air thick and difficult to breathe. Shaltir, however, was caught in a loop of her own logic. The price of precision. Shaltir stood amidst the splintered remains of the ancient oaks, her chest heaving. She stared at the golden smear on her lance, then at the skeleton standing before her. A jagged, manic laugh tore from her throat. "I see it now," she shrieked, her voice cracking with the strain of the brainwashing. "Illusionary blood. You are a master of the mind, Lord Ainz. You don't have flesh, so how could you bleed? You are trying to bait me into close quarters because you fear my magic. You want me to chase a phantom scent so you can dictate the flow of the dance." Ainz didn't correct her. He let a dark, prideful smile play across his lips, unseen beneath the mask of bone, but internally, the Titan's ego was roaring. He wasn't faking the blood. He was simply so powerful now that his enemies couldn't even comprehend his reality. In the throne room, the Guardians watched with bated breath. Pandora's actor stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the mirror with an intensity that bordered on the divine. "Observe," Pandora's actor commanded, his voice devoid of its usual theatrics. "Our creator is playing a game of layered intellect. He is using Shaltir's own brilliance against her. He knows she will overanalyze his every move. He is drawing this out not just for her, but to see if the cowards who did this to her will reveal themselves. He is forcing her into a corner while keeping his mana in reserve." He paused, his metallic fingers twitching. But there is a tremor in his hand. This new body is a wild stallion. His precision is off. He is preserving his mana not just out of habit, but because he knows a single missed spell in this state could level the forest. He is fighting his own power as much as he is fighting the vampire. Demiurge nodded slowly, his respect for the doppelganger's insight growing. A king who masters his own evolution while on the battlefield. Truly, he is incomparable. On the screen, Shaltir screamed and lunged. She tore through a barrage of greater rejection and wall of skeleton spells, her lance aimed for the mage's throat. She got close enough to smell the ozone, only for Ainz to drop the illusion of the staff. He didn't cast a spell. He swung a fist. The impact sounded like a mountain collapsing. The Titan's knuckles connected squarely with Shaltir's face, a blow of such raw, physical magnitude that her helmet shattered instantly. She was sent hurtling backward like a cannonball, snapping through massive trunks as if they were dry twigs. "No!" Demiurge shouted, his eyes wide. He saw the trajectory. Ainz had anticipated this. Before the first fireball had even been thrown, he had seeded that specific coordinate with a high-tier temporal stasis trap. As Shaltir crashed into the designated zone, the air turned a sickly purple. The trap triggered, but Pandora's actor's warning proved true. Ainz' timing was a microfraction off. Instead of a total body seal, the stasis field snapped shut only around Shaltyr's right arm and right leg, pinning her in midair like a butterfly on a board. Ainz didn't hesitate. He poured nearly 60% of his remaining mana into a single, devastating point. Maximize magic, Vermilion Nova. A pillar of flame's heat descended from above. The sky turned to fire. In a moment of sheer, desperate survival, Shaltyr realized she couldn't break the magic trap in time. With a guttural scream of agony, she summoned her internal energy and sliced through her own joints. She severed her own right arm and leg, falling to the dirt just as the pillar of divine destruction vaporized the spot where she had been pinned. Shaltyr hit the ground, a mangled, bleeding mess of red lace and raw meat. She looked up at the looming titan, her eyes wide with a terror she had never known. She was desperate. The smoke from the celestial pillar cleared, leaving a scorched wasteland where the forest had once breathed. The scent of burnt ozone and charred wood was overwhelming, but the most striking thing was the silence, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the eardrums of everyone watching. The price of a dog's death. Shaltyr lay in the dirt, a broken masterpiece. Her right side was a jagged mess of cauterized flesh where she had carved away her own limbs to escape the divine execution. She looked up at Ainz, her remaining eye flickering with a mixture of madness and a newfound, chilling clarity. Through her sensory abilities, she could feel the air around him. The crushing pressure of his mana, that infinite ocean she had always feared, was receding. It was still vast, but the tide had gone out. Your magic, she wheezed, coughing up a spray of silver blood. It has dropped. You poured everything into that trap, didn't you? Even a titan has a limit. She dragged herself toward him using her one remaining hand, her fingers clawing into the soot. Please, Lord Ainz, if you are truly a god, give me a fair fight. Do not hide behind these petty deceptions and traps. Face me as the warrior you claim to be. Ainz looked down at her, his massive shadow stretching over her broken form like a shroud. He didn't move to help her, nor did he offer a moment of mercy. The Titan's pride wouldn't allow it. A fair fight. Ain's voice was a low, seismic rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Shaltyr, you misunderstand the nature of power. I am the great tomb of Nazarick. I am the sum of 41 geniuses. A fight against me will never be fair. To expect fairness from a god is the ultimate height of mortal arrogance. Desperation gave Shaltyr a final, explosive burst of speed. She kicked off the ground with her one good leg, launching herself like a crimson bolt. She didn't aim for his heart or his gut. She aimed her sprute lance directly for the center of his forehead, the seat of his new, golden consciousness. Ainz didn't flinch. At the last possible microsecond, he tilted his head. The lance hissed past his ear, the wind of its passage cutting a thin line into his marble skin. Before she could reset, his hand, massive and heavy as a tombstone, clapped around her remaining ankle. With a roar of pure, physical dominance, Ainz swung her in a wide arc and slammed her back into the earth. The impact was cataclysmic. A crater 30 feet wide erupted instantly, the ground liquefying under the sheer force of the Titan's strength. Shaltyr bounced once, her body limp, and then lay still in the center of the pit. Her eyes rolled back into her head. She was unconscious. She was beaten. In the throne room, a collective sigh of relief swept through the Guardians. Cocytus hammered his lower arms together in a salute. Demiurge adjusted his glasses, his shoulders finally losing their murderous tension. It was over. The traitor had been subdued. Ainz stood at the edge of the crater, his chest heaving. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his golden eyes scanning the treeline. He searched for the hidden hands, the puppeteers who had dared to touch his property. But there was nothing. No magical traces, no hidden scouts. Where are they? Ainz muttered, his brow furrowing. to use a world item and then simply vanish? But the silence was broken by a wet, hacking cough. Shaltyr's fingers twitched. Then, with a jerky, unnatural motion, she began to rise. Her body was a wreck, her limbs missing, yet a dark, primal instinct had taken over. She didn't attack. She turned and took to the sky. Even with her horrific injuries, her racial speed as a true vampire surpassed the Titan's lumbering gait. "She's fleeing," Aura asked, confused. "There's nowhere to go. The perimeter is sealed." The Guardians relaxed again, thinking it the final act of a dying animal, all except one. "No," Albedo shrieked, her voice cracking with a terror that chilled the blood of everyone in the room. She lunged toward the mirror, her hands slamming against the glass. The dogs. Lord Ainz, the dogs. Ainz realized it a second too late. Shaltyr wasn't fleeing the battle. She was following a scent. She landed 50 yards away, right in the center of the crimson pile where the disrespectful mercenaries lay. Ainz had flayed them. He had broken them. He had left them in a heap of exposed muscle and stagnant, foul blood. To anyone else, it was a grisly warning. To a starving, dying vampire, it was a banquet. Shaltyr dived into the gore. She didn't just drink, she absorbed. The foul, commoner blood hissed as it entered her system, fueled by her own desperate mana. In a gruesome display of rapid regeneration, her missing arm and leg began to knit back together from the bone outward. She stood up amidst the corpses, wiping the red smear from her lips. Her armor was still broken, but her aura was raging. She looked at Ainz and let out a shrill, mocking peal of laughter. "You made true on your promise, Lord Ainz," she taunted. Her voice regained its cruel edge. "You killed them like dogs. And now their dog's blood has brought me back to life. Your mana is screaming, my lord. I can hear it gasping for air." She leveled her lance at him, a predatory grin splitting her face. "Are you ready for round 2? The atmosphere in the clearing shifted from the heat of a brawl to the chilling vacuum of a divine execution. Shaltyr's transformation was a grotesque spectacle, her elegant, if bloodied, form ballooned and twisted into a monstrous, avian lamprey hybrid. This was her true form, a manifestation of mindless slaughter that pulsed with the stolen vitality of the dead mercenaries. Ainz stood motionless as the wind from her transformation buffeted his massive frame. He looked at the golden blood, still sluggishly dripping from his knuckles, then at the monstrosity before him. "I was a fool," Ainz said, his voice dropping the booming resonance of the Titan for a flat, terrifyingly cold clarity. "My pride, this new blood in my veins, it made me soft. I sought the sensation of the fight. I sought to bring you back alive because I didn't want to lose a piece of our history." He looked up, his golden eyes narrowing. "But to allow you to feast on the filth I discarded? To let the masterpiece of Peroroncino degrade herself with the blood of dogs because of my own arrogance? That is my failure. And as a king, I must rectify my mistakes." Ainz raised a hand, and for the first time, the air didn't just vibrate, it fractured. "Enjoy the memory of this struggle, Shaltyr. For the next hour, I am no longer the hero Mammon, nor the nostalgic Mamanga. I am Ainzelgown. And you? You are no longer fighting a single man. You are fighting the collective might of the 41. He reached into the void, pulling out a set of shimmering, silver-blue plate armor that radiated a blinding, celestial light. In the throne room, Cocytus fell to all 4 of his knees, his mandibles chattering in a frenzy of religious awe. That? Armor. Cocytus, what is it? Aura asked, shielding her eyes from the glare reflecting off the magic mirror. It is the God-level champion armor. Cocytus's voice was a rasp of pure reverence. Only one who has defeated a world champion could hope to possess its like. But this has been refined by the guild Master. It does not just protect the body. It channels the specific combat data of the heroic class. On the field, the Titan was gone, replaced by a silver colossus. Ainz didn't stop there. He began reaching into the spatial rift with a speed that defied his size, pulling out artifacts that made the Guardian's heart stop. Takamikazuchi's 8 Malawian kwachas. Ainz roared, wielding the massive lightning blade in his right hand. Shield of Hoi. He strapped the lunar-blessed buckler of Nishikienrai to his left. Shaltir screeched and lunged, a tidal wave of blood and shadow. Ainz didn't dodge. He met her head-on. With every strike, he swapped weapons. One moment he was cleaving through her defenses with the heavy, dark magic axe of Olbert, and the next he was piercing her wings with the precision of Pero Roncino's backup bow. He was a whirlwind of the guild's history. Every swing carried the weight of a different creator, a different genius. He used Amino Mahatotsu's, smithing hammers to shatter her sprute lance, and Flatfoot's, hidden daggers to open gashes in her hide. You see, Shaltir? Ainz bellowed, his voice echoing from within the silver helm. This is what it means to be the Guildmaster. I am the keeper of their shadows. I am the bridge between their brilliance and your destruction. The Guardians watched, paralyzed. They weren't just watching a fight, they were watching a funeral procession for Shaltir's rebellion. Ainz was burning through the artifacts of their parents, using the very essence of the 41 to hammer the true vampire back into the dirt. He was relentless. He was efficient. He was the supreme being in his most terrifyingly complete form. The clearing had become a surreal gallery of divine destruction. Shaltir Bloodfallen had fully embraced the horror of her true form. No longer the elegant Valkyrie, she was a bloated, crimson monstrosity, a lamprey-headed avian horror with wet, needle-filled maws where skin should be. Her wings were tattered webs of muscle that beat with a sickening, rhythmic thrum. She was the pinnacle of Pero Roncino's obsession with the macabre, and in this state, her stats peaked, her instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. The shadows of the 41. Master. The true form of Shaltir hissed, the sound bubbling through the gore in her throat. The blood, it calls. Even your silver shell cannot hide the heat of the Titan beneath. She lunged. The speed was no longer magical, it was a physical law. She hit Ainz with the force of a falling star, her claws screeching against the god-level champion armor. Ainz didn't budge. His Titan legs were anchored into the bedrock of the world. Through the silver visor, his eyes burned with the cold light of a commander. You are at your best, Shaltir, Ainz rumbled, the sound amplified by the magical plate. Good. It would be a tragedy to erase you while you were anything less. But you forget. You are a masterpiece of one. I am the custodian of 41. With a flick of his wrist, the lightning blade Takamikazuchi's 8 Malawian kwachas vanished, replaced instantly by a massive, obsidian-heavy mace. Variable weapon, iron hammer of Amino Mahatotsu. Ainz swung. The impact caught Shaltir in her midsection, the divine weight of the Smith god's weapon ignoring her physical resistances. The sound was not a thud, but a wet, bone-deep crunch. She was sent spiraling upward, only for Ainz to swap weapons mid-motion. A massive, ornate longbow, the backup bow of Pero Roncino, appeared in his hands. He didn't need to draw an arrow. His Titan mana condensed into a bolt of pure, piercing light. Hoi's arrow. The bolt tore through Shaltir's left wing, pinning it to a tree half a mile away through sheer kinetic force. She shrieked, a sound that cracked the magic mirror in the throne room back at Nazareth. Cositus stood perfectly still, his mandibles vibrating so fast they hummed. The swap speed is impossible. He is not just using their weapons. He is executing their specific combat rhythms. In that moment, he was Peroroncino. A. Heartbeat. Before. He was Amino Mahitotsu. Demiurge adjusted his glasses, his eyes darting across the screen. He is burning through the equipment at a rate that would bankrupt a kingdom, all to ensure she doesn't have a single second to adapt. He is overriding her best with the absolute of the entire guild. On the field, Shaltir tore her wing free, her regeneration working overtime as she dived again. She swung her sprute lance in a desperate, wide arc, trying to find a gap in the silver plate. Ainz met her with Nishikienrai's daggers, so thank you. He moved like a shadow, the Titan's massive frame suddenly possessing the fluid, lethal grace of a ninja. He parried the lance and stepped inside her guard, the daggers carving deep, glowing furrows into her hide. Is this the limit of your best? Ainz taunted, his voice a low, prideful growl. Where's the fire? Where's the genius of your creator? Show me more, Shaltir. Force me to reach for the weapons of the ones I truly miss. He shoved her back, and the air around him flickered as he reached into the void once more. This time, he didn't pull out a sword or a bow. He pulled out a dark, pulsing orb, an artifact belonging to Punidomo. Strategy, Ainz whispered. Formation, Death's Door. The ground around Shaltir didn't just turn dark, it ceased to exist. A void opened beneath her monstrous feet, spectral chains of necroenergy rising to bind her in place. Shaltir realized the truth then. The Titan wasn't just a physical upgrade. It was a battery. It gave Momonga the raw physical capability to wield the items of his comrades with their original intended force, something his skeletal body often struggled to sustain. He was finally, truly, the avatar of Ainz Ulgaun. You are desperate, Shaltir, Ainz said, walking toward her with the heavy, rhythmic tread of an executioner. And you should be. For the first time in your life, you are looking at the combined shadow of your gods, and they have found you wanting. The battlefield had reached its final, agonizing crescendo. The blinding radiance of the champion armor flickered and died as Ainz's mana hit a critical threshold, the magical silver plating dissolving into motes of light. The skeletal illusion he had maintained, the familiar mask of Momonga, shattered like glass, falling away to reveal the raw, marble-hewn reality of the Titan. Shaltir skidded to a halt, her monstrous lamprey jaws unhinging in a silent gasp. For the first time, she truly saw him without the shroud of death. The golden veins in his skin pulsed with a fading light, and the sheer, primal magnetism of his form sent a jolt of recognition through her fractured mind. A deep, buried instinct flared within her, a desire to submit, to lust, to worship the sun-like divinity of her master. But the cold, jagged ice of the world item's command snapped her back. Her eyes turned back to hollow pits of red. The burden of a lord's grief. Flesh. Shaltir hissed, her voice a wet rasp. You have flesh. You have a heart that beats. That means you have a heart that can stop. She launched herself in a stampede, her wings beating a frantic, uneven rhythm. She was no longer a duelist. She was a predator sensing a closing window of opportunity. But Ainz had changed his rhythm. He no longer sought the sensation of the strike. He moved with a haunted, fluid grace, dodging her lunges by mere inches. As he moved, he laid small, efficient traps, gravity maelstrom, and obsidian barriers, not to kill, but to stall. Every motion was calculated to save the few drops of mana he had left. Shaltir, Ainz said, and for the first time, the pride was gone. His voice was thick with a heavy, soul-crushing weariness. I have reached a peace within myself. I spent so long trying to find a way to save you, to bring back the daughter of my friend. But I see now that to leave you in this state is a greater cruelty than the grave. He turned to face her, and the magic mirror in the throne room captured his face in agonizing detail. The guardians gasped. There was no rage there. His golden eyes were swimming with a profound, human sadness. The Titan's face was twisted in a grimace of paternal agony. Forgive me, Ainz whispered, the words intended only for her. Forgive me for not being strong enough to save you without killing you. In the throne room, the silence was broken by the quiet sobs of Aura and Mare. That is the dagger of Flatfoot, Cocytus noted, his voice trembling as Ainz drew a small, serrated blade to parry a strike. My creator's friend. Lord Ainz holds it with such care. And the ring, Demiurge added, his voice tight. That is the ring of Punito Mo. He is using it to calculate the exact millisecond of her exhaustion. He is using the memories of his friends to perform a mercy killing. Albedo clutched her chest, her heart breaking for the man who is suffering more than the one being struck. He carries all of them, she whispered. He carries the grief of 40 people while he fights. Ain's mana bar flickered in the corner of his vision. 10%. 8%. 5%. Shaltir felt it too. She could feel the heat of his presence fading into a cold ember. She pushed harder, her sprute lance a blur of desperate thrusts. Just a little longer, she thought, the madness screaming in her ears. If he runs dry, the Titan falls. If the mana dies, the god dies. Just a bit more. Shaltir shrieked, her clawed hand grazing Ain's cheek, drawing a thin line of golden blood. Empty yourself, Lord Ainz. Give me your last breath. Ainz didn't respond. He simply reached for a final, unassuming scroll tucked into his belt, an item not of a world disaster or a champion, but a simple, final tool of a guild master. The clearing was no longer a battlefield, it had become an altar of desecration. Shaltir, driven by a cocktail of madness and the predatory instincts of a true vampire, saw an opening in Ain's flagging defense. With a shriek that tore the sky, she bypassed his parry and sank her claws into his shoulder. With a sickening, wet wrench of physical power, she tore his left arm from the socket. The Titan did not scream. He staggered, golden blood erupting from the wound like a fountain of molten light. Shaltir did not let the essence fall to the earth. She caught the limb, her lamprey jaws widening to feast. She drank the blood of her god, her entire body arching in an ecstatic, blasphemous trance. The divinity of the fallen. Ah ha ha ha. Shaltir's voice was a chorus of lunacy. She smeared the golden ichor across her monstrous face, her eyes rolling back. It's warm. It's so warm, my lord. I can feel your soul in my throat. The dogs provided the meat, but you have provided the vintage. She discarded the arm, her regeneration flaring with a violent, golden hue as the divine blood integrated with her own. She felt invincible. She looked at Ainz, who stood swaying, his right hand clutching the empty air where his mana used to be. I see the end, Shaltir whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying lust. Your well is dry. I will put you out of your misery now, and I will keep your heart as my most precious treasure. I will use the filth of the dogs to drown you, and your own divinity to keep me satiated for eternity. She manipulated the stagnant, foul blood of the flayed mercenaries, weaving it into spears of black-red corruption that hung in the air like a firing squad. In the throne room, the silence was broken by the sound of Albedo vomiting from sheer, psychological distress. Cocytus had drawn all 4 of his swords, ready to shatter the mirror to reach his master. They trembled, a collective shudder of horror and disgust. To see a guardian consume the flesh of a creator was a sin that redefined the word atrocity. Enough, a voice commanded. Pandora's actor stood tall, his gaze piercing the mirror. He was the only one whose hands weren't shaking. Look closely, the doppelganger whispered. The show is over. Our father did not lose that limb by accident. He has spent the last hour baiting the shadows. He wanted the ones who did this to attack him while he was vulnerable. He wanted us to see their faces, to learn their weaknesses. But they are cowards. They are either cowering in a hole or they are dead by Shaltir's hand before the fight began. He looked at the others, his voice ringing with a cold, absolute certainty. He was waiting for a mercy that will not come. Now he will provide the only end left. The supreme ruler has already won. He is simply choosing the moment to stop the clock. On the field, Ainz looked up. The sadness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a void-like finality. "You've had your fill," Shaltir, Ainz said. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was the silence before the Big Bang. "You think my mana is gone? I told you. I am the custodian of the 41. He reached into his chest, not with a hand, but with his will. From his very soul, he pulled a hidden reserve, the mana of the guild, a secret stash accessible only to the master in the direst of straits. The air didn't just vibrate, it stopped. The blood spear Shaltir had created froze and turned to gray ash. The Titan's missing arm began to reform, not from flesh, but from solidified light. Super tier magic. The goal of all life is death, Ainz intoned. The clock appeared behind him, a massive, ticking circular void that spanned the entire clearing. Shaltir froze, the divinity she had just swallowed turning to ice in her veins. She realized too late, he hadn't been losing. He had been waiting for the timer to start. "Fallen down," he added, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 suns. The countdown hit 0. The white pillar of "fallen down" did not merely strike the earth, it erased the concept of the forest. The searing heat, amplified by the Titan's raw essence and the absolute finality of "the goal of all life is death," turned the clearing into a silent, colorless void. Shaltir Bloodfallen did not have time to scream. The divinity she had stolen, the monstrous form she had inhabited, and the very air she breathed disintegrated into fine, silver ash. In that final microsecond, the madness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a fleeting look of peace as she saw her master, not as a monster, but as her king one last time. The return of the sun. The dust of the super tier spell settled like snow. Ainz stood in the center of a glass-bottomed crater, his missing arm fully restored by the surging light of the guild's mana. The Titan's marble skin was scorched, and his breathing was heavy, echoing like the wind through a canyon. He turned his gaze toward the treeline. Aura and Mare stepped out from their hiding spots, their small frames trembling uncontrollably. They weren't just shaken, they were sobbing. The sight of their father figure being mutilated, the horror of the feast, and the sheer, terrifying scale of the finale had broken their stoic resolve. Ainz walked toward them, his footsteps heavy. He knelt, his massive frame dwarfing the children. "Aura, Mare," Ainz spoke, and the voice was soft, devoid of the prideful roar. "I apologize. To you, and to all the guardians watching through the glass. I put on a desperate, ugly show. I allowed myself to be desecrated to lure out a shadow that never arrived." He reached out, his massive hands hovering over them. "I hope you gained something from this. I hope you saw the cost of arrogance and the weight of a king's duty. But most of all," he bowed his head, a titan seeking penance from children. "I plead for your forgiveness. And I beg you, forgive Shaltir. She did not betray us. Even under the grip of a world item, she stayed in this clearing. She fought the urge to vanish into the world. She waited for me to find her and bring her home. She is a hero of Nazareth, not a traitor." The twins looked up, their tear-streaked faces reflecting the golden glow of his eyes. The weight of his humility was more overwhelming than his power. Then, the Titan's sorrow broke. Ainz threw back his head and barked a mighty, resonant laugh, a sound that carried the triumph of a survivor and the joy of a god who had saved someone from eternal suffering. "Enough of this gloom," Ainz roared playfully. He scooped Aura up with one hand, placing her gently on his broad, marble shoulder where she clung to his neck, still sniffing. He then reached down and cradled Mare in his other arm, holding the boy against his chest like a precious treasure. "We are going back," Ainz declared. "Greater teleportation." The space in the forest folded. In a heartbeat, they were no longer in the scorched wilderness, but in the heart of the great tomb. The air was cool, smelling of expensive incense and the familiar, sterile scent of home. The floor guardians were all there, lined up in a perfect, rigid formation. Demiurge, Cositus, Pandora's actor, and Albedo, whose face was still pale, but eyes burning with a renewed, fanatical light. Ainz stood before them. The Titan King returned, with his children in his arms. He looked at the architecture of his home, at the loyal faces of his creations. "I'm home," Ainz said, his voice a warm rumble that filled the hall. As one, the guardians slammed their fists against their chests or fell to their knees. The sound was like a thunderclap, vibrating through the very floors of the tomb. "Welcome home, my lord." The chorus was deafening, a roar of relief and absolute devotion that signaled the end of the nightmare. The Titan had returned, and Nazarick was whole once more. The gold and obsidian halls of the treasury flickered with the light of high-tier magic. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with the dread of war, but with a clinical, sharp anticipation. In the center of the ritual space, a massive pile of gold, the required tithe for the resurrection of a high-level NPC, glittered under the vaulted ceiling. Ainz stood at the head of the formation. To the surprise of his guardians, he had changed his attire once again. He wore a massive, billowing robe of crimson and violet silk, structured with jagged bone-like pauldrons and a high, feathered collar. It was an outfit that mimicked the silhouettes of Shaltyr's true form, a symbolic gesture of solidarity that only a Titan's frame could carry with such imposing grace. A/N. I should use the heart of the primordial idea again. The more I think about it, the more ideas that come to mind. Putting them in this story would be stupid. Remember to stay focused on this story first. The weight of the tithe. Before Ainz could initiate the command, Albedo stepped forward. Her fingers were interlaced, and her eyes were troubled. "My lord," she began, her voice small in the vastness of the chamber. "The gold is ready. The magic is primed. But what will come of her after she is revived? Can she truly return to her seat as if nothing occurred? The stain of this rebellion, even if forced, remains." Ainz looked down at her, the golden light of his Titan eyes reflecting off the gold pile. "She will be welcomed home, Albedo. Not as a prisoner and not as a failure. She will be welcomed as a sister who has returned from a long, dark journey." Pandora's actor, standing in a rigid, military salute, voiced the concern that gripped his analytical mind. "And if the corruption remains, Father? If the world item's influence was carved into the data of her soul and survives the transition of death? We risk a betrayal within these very walls." Ainz turned his gaze to his creation. "Then we adapt. From this moment forward, the isolation of the Guardians is at an end. Whether inside or outside these walls, you will move in groups. You are the pillars of Nazarick. If one is targeted, the other shall be the shield. If the brainwashing persists, we will deal with her together as a family." And then, his voice dropped to a seismic growl. "We will find the cowards who touched her, and we will erase them together." Demiurge adjusted his glasses, his eyes cold and calculating. "And her punishment, my lord? To allow herself to be caught, to force you to bleed and expend your divine mana. Surely a transgression of this magnitude requires a balancing of the scales." Ainz let out a short, hollow laugh that shook the nearby pedestals. "Punishment, Demiurge? I am still trying to decide what reward to give her," Ainz stated, shocking the archdevil into silence. She fended off the initial impulse of a world item. She stayed put in that clearing for days, fighting her own mind to ensure we could retrieve her. Her death was the first punishment, one shared by her and by me, for I allowed her to be vulnerable in the first place. Ainz stepped toward the gold, his massive hands glowing with the activation of the guild's resurrection system. He looked back at the assembled might of his loyal children. "Are you ready to welcome back Shaltyr Bleffallen?" The Guardians shifted instantly. The tension of the debate vanished, replaced by a sharp, battle-ready stance. Cositus drew his blades, Albedo gripped her bardiche, Demiurge tensed his claws. They were ready for a sister or a monster. "We are ready, Lord Ainz," they shouted in unison. Ainz turned back to the gold. "Then let the dead return. Resurrection." The gold began to liquefy, turning into a swirling vortex of shimmering light that spiraled toward the ceiling, coalescing into the shape of a girl. The vortex of liquefied gold reached a blinding crescendo, the metallic light thickening into the silhouette of a woman before collapsing into a soft, pale heap upon the obsidian floor. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of residual magical static. The return of the Valkyrie. Shaltir Bloodfallen lay curled on the cold stone, her skin as white as marble and devoid of the horrific scars of her true form. She was vulnerable, naked, and deathly still. The Guardians remained in their combat stances, their eyes scanning for the telltale crimson glow of the brainwashing. Ainz stepped forward, his massive frame casting a protective shadow over her. He reached into his inventory and pulled out his standard, high-tier robes, the deep violet and gold silks he usually wore. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for a Titan, he draped the heavy fabric over her small body, covering her completely. He stood over her, waiting. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Shaltir Bloodfallen. Cositus suddenly roared, the sound of his voice hitting the walls like a physical strike. The Supreme One stands before you. You are commanded to address your ruler. The girl on the floor flinched. Her eyes snapped open, no longer hollow and red, but filled with the sharp, wide-eyed confusion of the girl they knew. She scrambled to sit up, clutching the oversized robes to her chest as she realized her state. A deep, violent blush erupted across her undead face, turning her pale cheeks a dark, bruised crimson. What? Where am I? Why am I in the throne room like this? She squeaked, her voice high and frantic. She looked around, noticing the Guardians standing in a circle, their expressions a mix of relief, suspicion, and lingering shock. Why is everyone looking at me like I've grown a second head? And why is the room so small? Her gaze finally traveled upward, following the massive, silk-clad legs of the being standing before her. Her eyes trailed up the broad, muscled chest, past the powerful shoulders, and finally locked onto the Titan's face. Lord Ainz, she whispered. Her pupils dilated, and her breathing became a series of ragged, wet hitches. You've become so big, so thick, so meaty. She let out a soft, involuntary moan, her hands tightening on the robes. The way those muscles ripple under that skin, it's so incredibly primal. I feel like I could be crushed just by your shadow, and I find I don't mind the thought at all. Demiurge let out a long, weary sigh, adjusting his glasses with a finger. Pandora's actor, however, broke into a wide, triumphant grin behind his mask. The perversion was unmistakable. The obsession was back. The soul of Shaltir Bloodfallen was intact. Ainz felt a weight lift from his chest, a pressure he hadn't realized was suffocating him until this very moment. He walked over to her, his massive hand reaching down. Instead of a strike or a command, he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. As he did, a single, heavy tear of golden ichor escaped his eye and tracked down his marble cheek. Welcome home, Shaltir, Ainz whispered. Shaltir froze, her lustful rambling cut short by the sight of that tear. She began to stammer, her voice trembling with a new kind of panic. And my lord, you're crying. Because of me? Oh, please, forgive this lowly creature. I'll do anything. I'll let you break me 1,000 times over. Just don't weep for a failure like me. Aura and Mare were the first to break formation, rushing forward to hug her through the robes, followed by the booming welcomes of the others. The tension that had nearly fractured the great tomb of Nazarick finally dissolved into the warmth of a family made whole. The air in the room, which had briefly lightened with the warmth of Shaltir's return, suddenly curdled. The temperature seemed to drop as Albedo stepped forward, her black wings rustling with a sharp, metallic sound. Her eyes were no longer filled with relief. They were twin pools of molten, suppressed rage. The air of Nazarick. Shaltir, Albedo said, her voice a low, dangerous silk. Do you truly, honestly, not remember how you arrived here? Do you not remember a single moment of the last few hours? The forest? The blades? The blood? Ainz remained as motionless as a statue of antiquity. He loomed behind them, his titan eyes unblinking. He needed to know if the memory of her transgression, the memory of his own blood on her lips, remained. If she remembered, she would be crushed by the weight of her own guilt. If she didn't, she was spared a psychological death, but Nazarick remained in the dark about her final moments under the curse. Shaltir blinked, looking genuinely perplexed as she clutched Ain's oversized robes. I remember the humans. I remember the woman in the strange dress and the old man. I remember the light. After that, it's just a void, like a dreamless sleep until Cositus woke me up. The silence that followed was brittle. Albedo's presence began to leak out, a dark, suffocating miasma that demanded a sacrifice. Her hand twitched toward her side, her mind clearly looping on the image of Ainz bleeding because of the girl before her. She was a hair's breadth away from lunging, her loyalty to Ainz's personhood overriding her relief at his success. Suddenly, a sharp, flamboyant clap echoed through the hall. Oh, what a tragic lapse of memory! Pandora's actor cried out, spinning on his heel with a dramatic flourish of his trench coat. He struck a pose that was entirely too energetic for the gravity of the moment, effectively shattering Albedo's murderous focus. But fret not, Lady Bloodfallen, the doppelganger proclaimed, pointing a gloved finger at the ceiling. While you were off in the land of dreams, our glorious creator has been quite busy. He has made 3 sacred promises this day. 1, to destroy the dogs, finished. 2, to bring you home, finished. He leaned in close to Shaltir, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that reached every corner of the silent room. And the third? The third is the most magnificent of all. He has promised to grant Nazarick an heir. The word hit the room like a physical shockwave. Albedo froze. The dark aura around her vanished instantly, replaced by a stunned, wide-eyed vacuity. Her brain, which had been calculating 47 different ways to torture Shaltir, suddenly pivoted with the speed of a runaway train. An heir. Ainz Sama's child. A tiny titan with his eyes. A prince or a princess. A soft, high-pitched whistle escaped her lips as she began to sway, her face turning a shade of red that rivaled Shaltir's. Even Demiurge was caught off guard, his tail twitching in a rhythmic, stunned fashion as he processed the geopolitical and biological implications of a Titan-blooded dynasty. Ainz felt a bead of sweat, if a Titan could sweat, begin to form on his brow. He looked at Pandora's actor, who gave him a subtle, hidden thumbs up. It was a brilliant, if utterly chaotic, distraction. Enough, Ainz rumbled, seizing the moment before Albedo could recover her speech. He gestured to the shadows. The maids will escort Shaltir to her quarters. She needs rest and a proper change of clothing. A team of homunculus maids appeared instantly, gently lifting the confused and still blushing vampire. Ainz watched them leave, knowing he had bought himself peace for now, even if he had just ignited a fire in Albedo's heart that no amount of logic would ever put out. A/N. I might have messed up the story a little, because my knowledge is from the anime and not the novel. We'll revise later. Ainz sat alone in his private chambers, the obsidian shard of Olbert Alan Odal resting in his palm. The item was a masterpiece of hidden mechanics, a race stacker. In the rigid world of Yggdrasil, changing races usually meant resetting levels or losing old traits. But this artifact allowed the user to retain the base stats and racial passives of the previous form, effectively layering power like sheets of steel. He felt his level 100 cap groaning under the weight of his new titanic strength. If he could find the mana to trigger it again, he could become something beyond a god. But power was secondary to the stability of his children. The shadow of the mirror. The private audience with Demiurge had been enlightening and, in a way, heartbreaking. Ainz felt the familiar weight of his own indecision. He had hoped to spare Shaltir the trauma of seeing her own monstrosity, but Albedo and Aura had forced the issue. They did it to bridge the gap, Demiurge had explained earlier, his voice smooth but careful. The awkwardness was a poison, my lord. They couldn't look at her without seeing the blood on her face, and she couldn't look at them without sensing their hidden judgment. They showed her the truth to burn the poison out. Ainz understood. It was a brutal, pragmatic solution, one perfectly fitting for the denizens of Nazareth. After a 3-hour reprieve where Ainz shared the glorious tale of how he and Ulbert had once dismantled a world boss using a high-risk, chaos mana strategy, he had sent Demiurge away with a small, enchanted pocket watch that had once belonged to the great demon himself. The archdevil had looked at the item as if it were the heart of a star, his devotion reaching a fever pitch before he bowed out. Now it was time for the correction. Albedo and Aura stood before him, their heads bowed so low their hair obscured their faces. The Titan's presence filled the room, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark tide. I know why you're here, Ainz said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. You have 10 seconds to justify your actions. Start now. The countdown hung in the air like a guillotine. My lord, Aura squeaked, her voice cracking. We couldn't stand it. Everyone was being so nice to her, but we were all still so angry. Every time she laughed, we thought about the golden blood. We didn't want to hate her, Ainz Sama. We wanted to forgive her, but we couldn't do it while she was still innocent. We had to make her see. Albedo's wings twitched violently. It was selfish, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. We forced her to bear the burden of our grief so that we could feel better. We saw her as the traitor for a moment, and we couldn't live with that feeling unless she knew why we felt it. We are failures. Ainz let out a long, heavy sigh. He didn't roar. He didn't punish. He simply looked at them with a profound, weary disappointment. You prioritized your own emotional comfort over the mental stability of your sister, Ainz said quietly. You took a wound that was starting to scab, and you ripped it open to see if it was still red. I am not angry that you told her the truth. I am disappointed that you chose to do it without me, and for the wrong reasons. He waved a massive hand, the gesture dismissive and cold. Leave me. Go back to your duties and reflect on whether your forgiveness was worth the silence that now hangs over the first floor. Aura and Albedo fled the room, their sobs muffled by the heavy doors. Ainz stood up, the ground cracking under his weight. He didn't have time to dwell on his disappointment. He had a daughter of Nazareth to pull out of the dark. The air in the great tomb of Nazareth felt different today, heavier, yet charged with a renewed sense of purpose. Before addressing the crisis on the first floor, Ainz summoned Cocytus. Standing tall in the throne room, Ainz formally commissioned the warrior guardian to begin a reconnaissance and subjugation campaign in the surrounding wetlands. It was a strategic move to ensure the security of their borders, but also a way to keep the more martial-minded denizens focused while the heart of the tomb mended. With the order given, Ainz began his ascent. The walk of a king. Instead of using greater teleportation, Ainz chose to walk. He moved through the shifting scenery of each floor, his titan frame casting a magnificent silhouette against the bioluminescent flora of the 6th floor and the crystalline beauty of the 4th. As he passed, he stopped. He didn't just walk by the menial laborers or the low-tier guards. He approached a pair of skeleton warriors standing vigil at a corridor junction. The mindless undead rattled as they knelt, but Ainz placed a massive hand on the shoulder of one. Your vigilance does not go unnoticed, Ainz said, his voice warm and resonant. I appreciate your hard work. Nazareth is a fortress because of every stone and every soul within it. Thank you. A strange, spectral light flickered in the sockets of the skeletons. Though they lacked hearts to beat, the praise of their creator seemed to vibrate through their very marrow. Throughout his journey, Ainz repeated this, offering words of genuine gratitude to the cleaning maids and the area guardians alike. He wanted them to know that while he was a titan of power, he was still their master, and their efforts were his pride. Finally, he reached the 1st floor. The atmosphere here was stifling. The usual activity was hushed, overshadowed by the silence radiating from the private chambers of the floor guardian. Outside the heavy, ornate doors, Shaltir's vampire brides stood like statues. When they saw the Titan approaching, they bowed so low their foreheads touched the floor. Lord Ainz, we cannot get her to eat. She will not speak to us, one whispered, her voice trembling. I know, Ainz replied gently. Give us some time alone. Go tend to the lower crypts for an hour. They vanished into the shadows instantly, grateful for the reprieve. Ainz stood alone before the door. He looked at the intricately carved wood, sensing the profound grief radiating from within. He raised a massive hand and knocked a slow, deliberate sound that echoed through the hallway. There was no answer, only the hollow silence of a tomb within a tomb. Shaltir, Ainz called out. He didn't use the voice of a king or a titan. He used the voice of the man who had looked at her with a single golden tear in the treasury. Shaltir, it is I, open the door. Immediately, the silence was shattered. He heard a sharp gasp, followed by the frantic, clumsy sound of furniture being overturned and feet stumbling across the floor. The sound of a lock sliding back was fast and desperate. The door creaked open only a few inches, but the sliver of light from the hallway revealed a scene of absolute devastation. The chambers of the first-floor guardian, usually a sanctuary of Gothic elegance and meticulous order, looked as though a whirlwind of grief had torn through it. Tapestries were shredded, furniture was reduced to splinters, and the air was thick with the scent of old incense and stale despair. In the center of the wreckage stood Shaltir. She was the very embodiment of self-loathing. Her hair was matted, her eyes were bloodshot and hollow, and she shivered with a rhythmic, violent intensity. The bed of thorns. Ainz didn't hear her voice. Instead, a telepathic voice, fragile as spun glass and trembling with agony, echoed directly into his mind. My lord, please, do not look at me. Shaltir, Ainz said, his voice steady and calm. May I come in? There was a long, agonizing pause before she stepped back, her head bowed so low her chin touched her chest. She allowed the door to swing open fully. Ainz stepped into the ruin of the room. As he crossed the threshold, he made a silent mental adjustment. The Titan's height, while majestic, was a barrier here. He drew upon the fluid nature of his new form, willing his physical mass to compress until he stood at the height of his old overlord self, still imposing, but no longer a giant that filled the ceiling. He looked around for a place to sit, but every chair had been smashed into kindling. He turned to the large, velvet-draped bed, which remained the only intact piece of furniture in the room. May I sit here, Shaltir? She nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion. Ainz sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning slightly under his condensed, but still incredibly dense weight. He watched her. She stood near the far wall, pressing herself into the shadows as if she hoped the darkness would swallow her whole. She was still wearing the robes he had given her in the treasury, the oversized violet silks hanging off her frame, stained now with the dust of her grief. Are you afraid of me, Shaltir? Ainz asked softly. She shook her head no, but the movement was so frantic it caused the heavy robes to slip from her shoulder, revealing the pale, trembling skin beneath. It wasn't fear of him that radiated from her, it was a terror of her own reflection. Ainz reached out and patted the velvet beside him. Sit with me. She hesitated for a full minute before moving, her feet dragging across the floor. She sat at the very edge of the bed, leaving a wide gap between them. The distance felt like a canyon. Without a word, Ainz shifted closer. He reached out and placed a hand under her chin, his fingers firm but gentle. He tilted her face upward, forcing her to meet his gaze. Up close, the damage was even worse. Her face was a map of dried tear tracks, and a thin crust of dark, dried blood sat at the corner of her mouth, a grim reminder of the feast she had seen in the mirror. Stop, Ainz said, his golden eyes boring into hers. I know what you are feeling. I know the loop your mind is trapped in, replaying those 15 minutes of madness over and over. I know you are wondering how you can ever look at the others again. I know you are waiting for a punishment that hasn't come. He tightened his grip slightly, not to hurt, but to anchor her. You need to stop, Shaltir. You are mourning a ghost. That creature in the mirror, that was not the daughter of Pero Roncino. That was a weapon held by an enemy hand. Why do you insist on blaming the blade for the wound the swordsman dealt? The silence in the room grew heavy as Shaltir's lip trembled. She tried to look away, but Ainz's hand held her gaze steady. For a moment, the only sound was the jagged intake of her breath as she fought the urge to break down in the presence of her god. The Lord's absolution. But, my lord, her voice finally broke through the telepathic silence, a raw and raspy sound. I tasted your divinity. I relished in the tearing of your flesh. How can a child of Nazareth continue to exist knowing she found joy in the desecration of her creator? Even if it was a curse, the pleasure was in my heart. Ainz let go of her chin and instead wrapped his massive arm around her shoulders, pulling her firmly against his side. The sheer physical presence of him, the warmth and the unyielding strength of his Titan-layered form, seemed to force the air back into her lungs. Then you will use that guilt to fuel your loyalty, Ainz said, his tone shifting from gentle to commandingly firm. If you feel you owe a debt for those minutes, then pay it by living 10,000 years in service to this tomb. Do you think I brought you back so you could rot in a dark room? Do you think Pero Roncino would be proud to see his greatest creation reduced to a heap of rags and self-pity? The mention of her creator acted like a lightning strike. Shaltir stiffened, her eyes widening. He loved you, Ainz continued, his voice softening once more. We all loved you. When I fought you in that forest, I didn't see a traitor. I saw a tragedy. And when I struck you down, my heart broke for the necessity of it. If you continue to hate yourself, Shaltir, you are telling me that my grief was for nothing. You are telling me that I was wrong to save you. Shaltir's composure finally shattered. She turned into his chest, her small hands clutching the fine fabric of his robes as she let out a long, wailing sob. She wept for the shame, for the memory of the blood, and for the sheer, overwhelming mercy of the being holding her. Ainz simply held her, resting his chin atop her head. He let her cry until the frantic shaking turned into a dull, exhausted shiver. The blood on your face is gone, Shaltir, he whispered, his hand stroking her hair. The crater in the forest is sealed. The only person still keeping this war alive is you. I have forgiven you. The Guardians have forgiven you. Now, you must fulfill the one command I will not allow you to disobey. You must forgive yourself. He stayed there for a long time, sitting in the wreckage of her room, a god comforting a fallen angel. He knew this wouldn't be the end of her recovery, but the darkness that had threatened to swallow her had finally been pushed back. Now, Ainz said, pulling back slightly to look at her. Clean yourself. Dress in your proper attire. I am heading to the 6th floor to oversee the training of the new recruits. I expect my first floor guardian to be standing at her post when I return. Shaltir wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a flicker of her old spirit, sharp and devoted, returning to her gaze. Yes, my lord, I will not fail you again. I will be the shield you deserve. Ainz nodded, standing up and restoring his height to its full, majestic titanic stature as he reached the door. He glanced back one last time, seeing her standing amongst the ruins, clutching the robes he'd given her with a renewed, fierce grip. It was time to move forward. He had a kingdom to build and a third promise to consider. Ainz stepped out into the hallway, the heavy doors of Shaltir's chambers closing behind him with a resonant thud. The silence of the first floor felt less like a tomb now and more like a held breath. He knew that words were only the first step of the cure. Shaltir needed purpose to drown out the echoes of the forest. The weight of the crown. As Ainz descended toward the heart of Nazareth, his mind drifted back to the race stacker known as the Heart of the Primordial. The item thrummed in his pocket, a silent reminder that his own evolution was far from finished. He had successfully stabilized the Titan form, but the cost was a ravenous hunger for mana that even his massive pools struggled to satisfy. I need to experiment with the layering, he thought, his golden eyes scanning the intricate carvings of the hallways. If I can layer a race with high mana regeneration over this titanic strength, I will truly be invincible. But first, I have a promise to manage. The third promise, the promise of an heir, had spread through the tomb like wildfire. He could feel the eyes of every maid and shadow demon on him, their gazes filled with a mixture of reverence and intense curiosity. Pandora's actor had intended it as a distraction, but it had become a directive. He reached the 6th floor, the artificial sky currently set to a deep, twilight purple. Aura and Mare were there, overseeing a group of lizardmen warriors in a skirmish drill. When they saw the Titan approaching, the twins immediately called a halt to the training. They approached him with a lingering hesitation, their eyes still slightly red from their earlier encounter in his chambers. Lord Ainz. Aura called out, trying to sound energetic despite the guilt clearly weighing on her shoulders. The recruits are showing 15% improvement in their formation stability. Ainz looked over the lizardmen, then back at the twins. He knelt down, bringing his massive face level with theirs. Aura, Mare, he said, his voice soft. I have just come from Shaltyr's room. Both children stiffened. Mare gripped his staff so tightly his knuckles turned white. She is recovering, Ainz continued. I have ordered her back to her post. When you see her, do not look at her with pity, and do not look at her with the shadow of what you saw in the mirror. Look at her as your sister. Can you do that for me? Mare nodded vigorously, tears threatening to spill again. Yes, my lord. We just wanted things to be the way they were. Things will never be exactly the way they were, Ainz said, placing a heavy, warm hand on each of their heads. We are evolving. All of us. But we do not leave our own behind in the process. He stood up, his gaze turning toward the horizon of the floor. In the distance, he could see Albedo standing on a balcony of the administrative wing, her wings folded tight, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that suggested she was already drafting names for a royal nursery. He sighed, the sound like wind through a mountain pass. The battle with Shaltyr was over, but the battle for the future of his family had only just begun. He had to be more than a king. He had to be the anchor for their souls. Cocytus is on the move, Ainz muttered to himself. The borders are expanding. It is time I look toward the next race. Perhaps a race of wisdom, or one of infinite mana. He walked toward the center of the arena, his shadow growing long under the twilight sky, the Titan King ready to shape the world into his image. The sun of the lizardmen's wetlands hung heavy in the sky, reflecting off the newly constructed base at the edge of the great forest of Tob. Inside the tactical command center, the air was cool, but the atmosphere was thick with the shifting dynamics of Nazaryk's leadership. The throne of flesh and bone. Cocytus stood at attention, his icy exoskeleton shimmering. The campaign was reaching its zenith, and the warrior guardian had demonstrated a strategic growth that pleased Ainz. The conversation followed the familiar rhythms of military reporting, but the focal point of the room was the small, trembling figure of Shaltyr Bloodfallen. She stood near the back, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her skirt. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice a fragile whisper. My lord, may I have permission to speak? Ainz, seated in a temporary chair, nodded. Speak, Shaltyr. I don't understand, she stammered, looking at the floor. I have caused you pain. I have wasted your mana. I have failed in my duty. Why have I not been broken? What do the others truly feel for me? I see no hatred in their eyes, and it terrifies me more than their anger. Ainz leaned forward, his golden eyes glowing with a dull, heavy light. Shaltyr, you seek the clarity of pain to wash away your guilt. You believe a single execution or a lashing would balance the scales. It will not. He paused. He stood up, his Titan form dwarfing everyone in the room. He walked toward the center of the base where a throne of bone had been prepared. Instead of sitting, he gestured to the floor. Punishment the first, Ainz commanded. Kneel. Shaltir obeyed instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. I am a Titan now, Shaltir, Ainz said, his voice cold and authoritative. My weight is no longer that of a hollow skeleton. It is the weight of a mountain. You will serve as my throne for the duration of this day. You will feel every ounce of my burden, and you will not falter, for if you cannot support your king, you cannot support Nazarick. As Ainz lowered himself onto her back, Shaltir let out a sharp, choked gasp. The weight was immense. It felt as though the very crust of the earth was pressing down on her spine. But beneath the strain, a manic, blissful light ignited in her eyes. This was use. This was purpose. This was the weight of her god. Albedo stood to the side, her wings twitching with a violent, repressed jealousy. To be the foundation of his rest, to feel his warmth and his power crushing me into the dirt, she thought, her teeth grinding together so loudly they could be heard across the room. To distract himself from the oddity of the situation, Ainz activated the mirror of remote viewing to check the progress of the lizard men. The image flared to life, but within seconds, Ainz's hand snapped out and deactivated the mirror with a sharp crack. The lizard men, specifically Zariasu and Crush, were engaged in an act of primal procreation. Disgusting creatures, Cocytus rumbled, his mandibles clicking in disapproval. To engage in such carnal displays before a battle? Ainz composed himself, his Titan mind filtering the awkwardness into a lesson of leadership. No, Cocytus. You see filth, I see survival. They face extinction at our hands. They are doing the only thing left to them, ensuring that their race does not vanish from this world. It is a desperate, biological duty. The Guardians bowed their heads, struck by the profound wisdom of his insight. Demiurge stepped forward, his eyes gleaming behind his glasses. Indeed, my lord. Even the lowest beasts understand the necessity of a lineage. All of Nazarick, from the lowest maid to the highest guardian, waits with bated breath for the day we may serve your own bloodline. Ainz felt a strange surge of heat in his chest, a lingering side effect of the Titan form that pushed aside his emotional suppressor. He felt pride. He felt a dark, commanding lust for the future he was building. He looked at Demiurge, his gaze sharp and predatory. If you are so eager, Demiurge, then I shall give you a task, Ainz said, his voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. You are in charge of finding women worthy of this mantle. Not just anyone, they must be willing, capable of surviving the union and deserving of the honor. For everyone you find who meets my standards, I will provide Nazarick an heir. He leaned back, the weight of his words pressing harder onto Shaltir. How many such women can you find within the span of 172 hours? The first choice is always the most critical, but if her quality satisfies me, I will allow you to continue. The timer begins the moment Cocytus concludes his campaign. The room fell into a deafening silence. Demiurge's tail lashed back and forth, his face splitting into a grin of pure, intellectual ecstasy. I understand, the archdevil whispered, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. I will not fail you, my lord. I shall scour the world for the vessels of your legacy. The marshlands fell silent as the final echoes of Cocytus's swordsmanship faded into the mist. The Lizardman heroes lay defeated, but not without honor, an outcome that Cocytus reported with a newfound, rigid pride. With the submission of the tribes complete, the campaign reached its official conclusion. The moment Cocytus knelt before Ainz to signal the end of his duty, an invisible clock began to tick. The Great Harvest. Demiurge did not waste a single second of his allocated 172 hours. While the rest of the Guardians returned to their routine duties, the Archdevil of Nazarick became a shadow across the continent. He did not merely look for women, he filtered reality. He sought candidates with high mana compatibility, physical resilience to withstand a Titan's presence, and a psychological profile that could handle the weight of Nazarik's dark divinity. The first 48 hours, the evaluation. Demiurge established a selection bureau in a pocket dimension. He utilized the shadow demons to scour the royal lineages of the Riestei's kingdom, the Empire, and even the hidden enclaves of the slain theocracy. He wasn't looking for beauty alone, though beauty was a prerequisite. He was looking for vessels. Hour 24, he discarded 4,000 noble women whose bloodlines were too diluted by mediocrity. Hour 48, he narrowed the search to 17 individuals across the map who possessed rare talents or ancient bloodlines. Hour 72 to 120, the testing. Demiurge moved from observation to interaction. He did not kidnap them immediately. He tested their willingness through subtle psychological manipulation and dream weaving. He presented them with visions of a golden king, a titan who promised a world of order and power. By the 5th day, the selection had dwindled to a terrifyingly specific few. Albedo, meanwhile, was a storm of silent fury within the tomb. She knew she was the primary candidate, but the fact that Demiurge was searching outside Nazarik felt like a calculated move to ensure the diversity of the master's lineage. Hour 144, the final selection. As the clock neared its end, Demiurge returned to the great forest of Tob. He stood before the mirror of remote viewing, his eyes glowing with a manic, intellectual fervor. He had 3 dossiers prepared, 3 women who had not only survived the magical scrutiny, but had, in their dreams, pleaded for the Titan's arrival. Inside the command base, Ainz remained seated upon Shaltir. The vampire guardian was drenched in cold sweat, her muscles trembling under the sheer, unmoving mass of the Titan yet. She wore a look of religious ecstasy. She had been his chair for nearly a week, and her spirit had never been stronger. Hour 172, the conclusion. The door to the command center hissed open. Demiurge stepped in, his suit perfectly pressed, not a single hair out of place. He checked his pocket watch, the gift from Ainz, and snapped it shut precisely as the final second ticked away. "The time has elapsed, my lord," Demiurge announced, his voice smooth as aged wine. Ainz stood up from Shaltir, who collapsed onto the floor with a soft, satisfied moan, her body finally surrendering to the fatigue. Ainz looked at his strategist. The Titan's mana felt coiled, ready to strike. "Report," Ainz commanded. "Within the allotted time, I have scoured the known world," Demiurge said, kneeling. "I have found 3 who are worthy of the first trial. One is a princess of a dying line with a talent for mana storage. The second is a priestess who has spent her life seeking a god who actually answers. And the third." Demiurge paused, a cruel, clever glint in his eye. "The third is a hero of the humans who believes she is fighting for justice, but who would gladly trade her soul for the power to actually achieve it. They are willing, they are capable, and they are waiting for their king to claim them." Ainz walked toward the mirror, his shadow looming over Demiurge. "And Albedo?" "She is agitated, my lord," Demiurge admitted. "But she understands that her role is that of the Empress. These others, they are merely the soil in which you shall plant the seeds of our future." Ainz barked a short, dark laugh. "Well done, Demiurge. Let us see if these vessels can truly satisfy the hunger of a Titan." The air in the throne room was thick with a new kind of anticipation. Ainz sat upon the throne, the actual throne of kings this time, his Titan frame draped in robes of heavy midnight silk. Demiurge stood at the base of the dais, holding 3 scrolls of high-quality vellum, each sealed with the wax crest of Nazarik. The goddess of the slain theocracy. Demiurge ascended the steps and presented the papers. "My lord, the dossiers you requested. Each contains a psychological profile, a list of habits, mana compatibility ratings, and the specific reasons they meet your criteria of being willing, capable, and deserving." Ainz took the papers, his massive fingers tracing the parchment. Internally, his mind was racing in a way his emotional suppressor could barely handle. "I honestly didn't think he'd find anyone," Ainz thought. a cold sweat forming on his marble brow. I added the deserving clause specifically to see if he'd tried to nominate Albedo or Shaltir. I thought I was being clever, setting a trap to test his information-gathering speed. I expected to laugh this off and tell him it was just a drill to see how much he could learn about the outside world without being detected. He began to skim the first paper, intending to offer a polite, safe rejection. Then his eyes locked onto a name, Antilene Heron-Fouché. The image attached was a magical rendering of a woman with heterochromatic eyes and hair of split silver and black. Ainz's breath hitched. As he read the description, the Zeshi Zetsumi of the slain theocracy, a being of half-elf blood who sat atop a mountain of corpses, waiting for a man strong enough to defeat her, a primal heat surged through his titanic veins. Her appearance was hauntingly beautiful, her personality a jagged edge of boredom and lethal intent. She wasn't just willing, she was yearning for a predator who could dominate her strength. She's incredible, the Titan's blood roared within him. She isn't just a vessel. She's a masterpiece. Ainz looked up, his golden eyes burning with a sudden, predatory intensity that made even the air in the room vibrate. The hero, part of him, wanted to let Demiurge down easy, but the Titan demanded the prize. Demiurge, Ainz spoke, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. I will be honest. This was a test of your intelligence-gathering capabilities, a challenge to see if you could penetrate the most secure layers of the New World in a mere 172 hours. I did not truly expect you to succeed in finding someone worthy of the Great Tomb. He tapped the paper of Antilene. But you have exceeded my wildest expectations. This woman, she is acceptable. I reject the other two. They are pebbles in the presence of a mountain. But this one? She shall be the first. Demiurge bowed his head, a flush of dark pride crossing his features. I am honored, my lord. I will admit, I harbored doubts that this world could produce anything worthy of your lineage. I viewed it as a wasteland. But I cast aside my own bias to fulfill your command. If she pleases you, then the wasteland has a purpose after all. Ainz barked a dark, satisfied laugh. You have earned a bonus reward for this, Demiurge. I shall consider what is fitting. For now, know that you have laid the foundation for a conquest that is no longer just about territory, but about the blood that will rule it. Satisfied, Demiurge stepped back, performed a perfect aristocratic bow, and exited the throne room. As the heavy obsidian doors closed behind him, Demiurge made his way down to the lower floors. When he reached the transit hub, he found the other floor guardians waiting in a tense, silent semicircle. Albedo's eyes were bloodshot. Shaltir looked as though she might faint. Even Cocytus's frost was steaming with anxiety. Well, Albedo hissed, her voice trembling. Did he reject your lists? Demiurge didn't stop. He walked right past them, his tail swaying in a slow, rhythmic arc of triumph. He didn't look back as he spoke, his voice ringing with a cold, absolute certainty. Of course I succeeded. Prepare yourselves. A new era for Nazarick begins now. The month of transition had been a period of profound self-discovery for Ainz. Through rigorous meditation and the mechanical mastery of the race stacker, he had finally reached a point of absolute biological control. He could now shift between the skeletal overlord, the form he considered his true self, and the muscular titan at will. The taste of humanity. The overlord form remained his preference. It was cold, logical, and stripped of the biological impulses that complicated his leadership. In his skeletal body, the emotional suppressor was a constant, stabilizing hum. However, the Titan form offered something the undead could never possess, the ability to taste. Occasionally, Ainz would retreat to his private dining hall in his Titan form, indulging in the culinary masterpieces of the head chef. He would savor the textures and spices, a small, human luxury that he kept strictly private. Yet, the cost was high. The Titan blood was a living, pulsing thing that demanded pride and felt the stirrings of a lust he hadn't experienced since his days as Satoru Suzuki. It was unsettling, a wild animal he had to keep caged within his own skin. The Titan shall be a secondary figure, Ainz decided, adjusting his color. Like Mammon. A separate entity to be feared or admired, while the Overlord remains the absolute ruler of Nazarick. Before focusing on the future of the kingdom, Ainz realized there was a piece of property he needed to reclaim. He had left his high-tier robes in Shaltir's care, and it was time to retrieve them. He entered her chambers, now perfectly restored to their Gothic splendor. Shaltir stood to greet him, her eyes bright with a devotion that bordered on the fanatical. "My lord, you have come to visit," she chirped, her hands immediately going to the clasp of the heavy violet robes she still wore. "I have come for my attire," Shaltir Ainz said simply. Without a word of protest or a hint of hesitation, Shaltir reached for the collar and simply let the robes fall. The heavy fabric slumped to the obsidian floor, revealing her naked form in the dim light of the room. She stood there unashamed, her gaze fixed on him with a silent, pleading invitation. Ainz felt the Titan blood roar in his ears, a sudden heat flushing through his system that made his vision swim. It took every microfraction of his willpower, an effort more taxing than his fight against the slain theocracy's shadows, to keep his expression neutral. "I see," Ainz managed to choke out, his voice a pitch deeper than intended. He used his mana to whisk the robes into his inventory with a sharp flick of his wrist. "You are dismissed, Shaltir." He turned and exited the room with a speed that almost looked like fleeing. Behind him, he heard Shaltir let out a long, disappointed sigh that made his skin crawl with a mix of guilt and lingering adrenaline. Once safely back in his overlord form, the cool wave of his emotional suppressor washed over him, dousing the flames of the Titan's desire. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "That was nearly a catastrophe," he muttered. With his composure restored, Ainz set his sights on the 6th floor. The war for the wetlands was over, and the integration of the lizardmen was well underway. It was time to see if Cocytus's governance was as sharp as his blade. He found the Frost Guardians standing at the edge of the central lake, watching a group of lizardmen children playing in the shallows under the watchful eye of a Nazarick old guard. "Cocytus," Ainz called out, his skeletal robes billowing in the artificial breeze. "Report on the state of our new subjects. Do they thrive under the shadow of the tomb?" Meanwhile, with Shaltir. The dim, amber light of the 9th floor bar glinted off the crystal glass in Shaltir's hand. She swirled a thick, crimson liquid, a high-grade blood cocktail, with a look of dazed, lingering heat. The heavy doors swung open, and the clicking of heels against the marble announced Albedo's arrival. The overseer didn't look happy. She looked like a woman who had been chewing on glass for a week. She slid onto the stool next to the vampire, her black wings rustling with a sharp, aggressive snap. "The conspiracy of the queens." "He went to your room," Albedo said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I saw him leave. He was flustered." "What did you do, you shriveled grape?" Shaltir didn't even snap back. She leaned her head back, a dreamy sigh escaping her lips. "I was so close, Albedo. Incredibly close. I dropped the robes, the ones he gave me, and for a moment, the Titan in him almost roared. I saw it in his eyes. He wanted to stay. He wanted to claim what was his." Albedo's grip on the bar counter tightened until the wood began to groan. He left because he is a king of self-control. He would never succumb to such a cheap, tawdry display. "Perhaps," Shaltir whispered, leaning in closer, her eyes glittering with a predatory cunning. "But even a king has limits. And I have an idea. One that would make it impossible for him to flee." She leaned toward Albedo's ear, her breath cold against the overseer's skin. "What if he didn't have to choose? What if he found us both waiting for him? No robes. No barriers. Just the 2 pillars of Nazarick, ready to be his foundation." Albedo stiffened, her breath catching. The image burned through her mind, a vision of absolute submission and shared victory. Think about what Demiurge told us, Shaltir continued, her voice like honeyed poison. We asked him what the master seeks. He said the woman he found, this Antiline, is a blend of us. She is powerful like you, beautiful and influential, but she possesses that same primal, lethal edge that I do. She wants the strongest man to give her the strongest child. She has never been bested. Shaltir turned her glass, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. But she is a substitute, Albedo. A blend because he couldn't have the originals at once. I have been defeated by him, yes, but you remain his undefeated shield. Put us together, and you have a 100% success rate. We are the blueprint. She is just the copy. Albedo's eyes widened, the logic piercing through her jealousy. She looked at Shaltir, seeing not a rival, but a strategic partner. If we follow my lead, Shaltir murmured, he won't be able to retreat into his overlord logic. The Titan will have nowhere to run. Albedo's hand slowly relaxed on the counter. A dark, fanatical smile began to spread across her face, the kind of smile that boded ill for the peace of Ainz's private chambers. Together, we would be irresistible. He wouldn't just be choosing a woman. He would be choosing his empire's future. Exactly, Shaltir giggled, raising her glass in a mock toast. So, sister, are you ready to become the mother of gods? Standing on the lush plains of the 6th floor, Ainz felt a sudden, inexplicable chill travel up his spine, rattling his ribs with a sharp, metallic clatter. He looked around, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. The lizardmen were training with a newfound ferocity. The Death Knights were standing like monolithic sentinels of order, and Hamsuk was currently engaged in a surprisingly effective wrestling match with a group of tribal warriors. Everything was perfect, and yet that shiver remained. Is it a high-tier divination spell? Ainz wondered, his hand instinctively going to his chest. Or is it just the lingering ghost of Satoru Suzuki's anxiety? He shook the feeling off and initiated his return to the 9th floor. As he transitioned through the hallways, he felt a surge of genuine pride. Despite the Titan's blood trying to rewrite his personality into that of a hedonistic conqueror, he had remained steadfast. He had looked upon a naked Shaltir and successfully retreated with his dignity and his virginity intact. I am a master of my own soul, he muttered, returning to his overlord form. The familiar, cool embrace of his skeletal frame felt like home. Here, logic was king. Here, he was the supreme one, untroubled by the messy impulses of the flesh. A notification pinged in his mental HUD. It was Albedo. Message, my lord. I find my combat efficiency has plateaued. I humbly request a friendly spar to refine my defensive maneuvers. Would you grace me with your tutelage in the arena? Ainz hummed thoughtfully. A spar would be a perfect way to vent the day's remaining tension. Acceptable, he replied. The duel was magnificent. They started in the arena, but as the intensity rose, they moved beyond the walls, using the vast, simulated terrain of the floor as their chessboard. Albedo fought with a desperate, lunging hunger that Ainz attributed to her drive for perfection. He countered with the cold, calculating precision of a level 100 magic caster, enjoying the sheer mechanical thrill of the exchange. Excellent work, Albedo, Ainz panted metaphorically as his body lacked lungs as they finally wound down. Let us return to my study. There are documents regarding the Riestei's grain trade that require your signature. As you wish, my lord, Albedo replied, her voice strangely breathy. They reached the doors of Ainz's private suite. Ainz pushed them open, stepping into the dim, lavender-scented air of his inner sanctum. He turned the corner toward the massive, velvet-draped bed, intending to set the documents down. He froze. Shaltir Bloodfallen was sprawled across the center of the bed. She was completely naked, her skin pale as moonlight against the dark fabric, her eyes burning with a look of predatory triumph. She didn't say a word. She simply arched her back and gestured to the space beside her. Ainz's internal logic processor stalled. He began to turn, his skeletal hand reaching for a teleportation scroll, only to be stopped by a heavy, metallic clink. He looked back. Albedo stood in the doorway, her black armor discarded in a pile at her feet. She was as bare as the vampire on the bed, her wings unfurled to block the exit, her expression one of absolute, unyielding devotion. The disturbance he had felt earlier finally made sense. This wasn't a rebellion of swords, it was a rebellion of the heart. Ainz felt his overlord form begin to shimmer. The sheer psychological pressure of the moment, combined with the lingering adrenaline of the spar, cracked his mental dam. The Titan's blood, sensing the proximity of his two greatest treasures, surged forward with the force of a tidal wave. His bones expanded. His skin knitted together in a flash of golden light. The Overlord's logic vanished, swallowed whole by the Titan's roar. There was no escape. There was no teleportation. There was only the fulfillment of a promise he had made to his lineage. The Supreme One looked at his guardians, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to think. He wanted to rule. So be it, the Titan rumbled, his voice shaking the foundations of the tomb. The lights of the 9th floor dimmed as the door clicked shut, sealing the fate of Nazarik's future. "Come give me my reward, my lord. I've been waiting," were the words that completely got rid of his emotional suppressor. A woman with pale white skin and heterochromia, for both her eyes and hair, felt robbed. She didn't know why or what of, but her woman's intuition told her so. A/N, this is a proper area to end off at. I never write harems, but for some reason the story ended up like that. I didn't want to do it or have Shaltir be in a harem, it just happened. When I took a break from this story, I left summaries for me to remember what I was thinking and what was going on. The final word count was 21,551 words. Not too bad, not too good. Did I hit it just right? No clue, so I'll let the audience decide that. I tried erasing the notes I left behind throughout the story, and a few still remain. At least I found the really questionable ones. Enough of my ramblings. Thank you for reaching the end.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.